we genuinely censored and blacklisted anyone who expressed even remote skepticism about climate. You know, I'm not a denier. They call me that all the time. I don't deny that carbon dioxide has a warming effect. I don't deny we're in a warming period. I don't deny that human emissions are contributing. I just deny that it's a massive existential threat that is more important than affordable energy for the poor in the developing world.
Matt Ridley says the world knows the climate crisis is over and Britain needs to catch up.
We are now in a new world where the roughly 40 years of alarm over global warming is coming to an end. And by the way, the science supports that.
Matt says our commitment to net zero is economic suicide and an attack on the poor.
I'm sorry, in what world do you say to poor people today in Africa who haven't even got electricity, you must make sacrifices so that people who are 5 times as rich don't have to be only 4.5 times as rich? That is the most regressive policy I have ever heard of. But that is roughly what we are asking to do by pursuing net zero.
We talk about innovation and the need for science to resist ideological capture.
There was this push to declare consensus again and again in science. It became, I'm sorry to say, like the Catholic Church. There's one true faith and you have to do what the Pope says, which I don't think is the way that science should operate.
Welcome to British Thought Leaders. I'm Lee Hall. Today I'm sitting down with writer, scientist and hereditary peer Matt Ridley. Matt, welcome back.
Lee, thank you for having me. It's nice to be here.
I wanted to first talk with you about the great climate climb down. You wrote about this in The Spectator. And can you talk us through what's happening, what changes we're seeing?
Well, I think in Britain, people are in denial or at least not catching up with what's happening. In America and much of the rest of the world, the climate alarm is pretty well over, dead and buried. Now, why do I say that? I say that because energy policies are now basically going ahead without any reference to the need to decarbonise to anything like the same extent they did before. But I also say that the pressure to make a political issue out of global warming is vanishing. You see that in the fact that the Democrat Party in America doesn't make an issue out of it anymore, not just the Republicans. So in Britain, we're behind the curve on this. We still think it's an existential risk. We still think it's the most important thing we're doing. We still think that it's vital that Britain provide a lead to the world in decarbonising, and we take the threat of climate change very seriously at an official level. But even here, large chunks of the population which weren't allowed to express sceptical views along the lines of climate is changing, yes, but is it really a crisis? Is it really an emergency? Maybe not. They weren't allowed to express those views. They are now voting with their feet politically as well. So I think we are now in a new world where the roughly 40 years of alarm over global warming is coming to an end. And by the way, the science supports that. The science has steadily pulled back on the high-end projections of how much warming would happen, and has steadily had to admit that droughts, floods and storms are not being exacerbated by climate change, and that fewer people are dying as a result of weather extremes rather than more, and so on. So all that is happening, and it's vital that Britain catches up, because we're rushing headlong into expensive energy on the grounds that that will enable us to cut emissions.
Most people are happy with the idea that the temperature may be changing and we may need to adapt in certain ways, but they're not so happy with the idea that the end of the world is coming, fewer freedoms and more taxes may be added to that. How did the climate change become the climate crisis, and what was behind that?
Well, they changed the terminology. They started with global warming, and then they said, well, let's call it climate change so that we can blame blizzards on it as well as heat waves. And then they said that's not really exciting people enough, so let's call it global heating, and that didn't really catch on. So they said, well, let's call it a climate emergency, and that didn't really work, so they now call it a climate crisis. I mean, I'm afraid that's literally what's happened, an attempt to make it sound scarier than it is. I've been writing about this for more than 40 years. I first wrote about it at The Economist. To start with, I believed the alarm. I thought we were in for 3 or 4 degrees of warming in a century, and that could be catastrophic, and you'd see hugely, rapidly rising sea levels and so on. And gradually, I came to realize that the models that were projecting that had built into them exaggerated feedback effects, mainly to do with clouds and water vapor, that were simply not realistic. So they've pulled back, as I say, on the projections. We're seeing sea level rise about 3 to 4 millimeters a year. That's about a foot per century. And that's roughly how much it rose in the 20th century. We coped with that. You know, Jakarta is nearly 2 meters below sea level. So are many parts of the Netherlands. You build a dike, you know, you cope with that. If necessary, you build a slightly higher dike. There's no sense in which that is a genuine existential threat, a foot of sea level rise per century. And as for the other effects, well, the warming is mostly concentrated in the north, in the far north, in the Arctic, in winter and at night. Right? Now, well, that's where the least people are active, at night, in winter, in the Arctic. In the tropics, in the daytime, the effect is tiny. And this is exactly what you'd expect, because it's a loss of, it's a lower rate of heat loss, not a higher rate of heat gain. So you would expect that daytime tropical temperatures wouldn't change much, and indeed they haven't.
Scientists, journalists, lawmakers, some of them must have had an inkling that there was exaggeration going on. Why did so many of them just go along with it?
Well, I'm afraid one of the problems is that a lot of people now have an enormous amount of vested interest in climate. Their entire careers depend on it. They go to international conferences, all expenses paid, to discuss it. They sit down in meetings. They advise companies which pay them handsomely to advise them on climate protection and so on. There is an enormous vested interest in this business. Now, people say, well, there's an enormous vested interest in fossil fuels. Well, actually, it's nothing like as powerful a lobby now as the other. I mean, the renewable energy industry alone spends a fortune on lobbying, for example. And I used to have a direct interest in fossil fuels myself. That made me a bit more careful about what I said, particularly about coal, because that's what I had an interest in. But now I don't, so I can say what I actually think. And nobody's paying me to do this. I mean, it's, you do not get rewarded for being skeptical about climate change. If I turned around tomorrow and said, I was wrong, it's a real existential threat to mankind, and I'm going to campaign hard for it, my speaking fees would go through the roof.
What happened to the people who have been sceptical over these last 40 years and did speak out?
Well, let me give you one example. There's a wonderful scientist in America called Judith Curry. She's a very serious and senior climatologist. She rose through the ranks at different universities to be chair of Earth Sciences at a university in Georgia. And she became very famous as an alarmist climate scientist when she published a paper saying that it looks like hurricanes are getting worse just before Hurricane Katrina, right? And so she became a rock star. Everybody wanted her on television, etc. And then some skeptics said, look, I don't think your paper is right because we've got patchy data, and when you analyze it differently, it doesn't look like there is an increase in hurricanes. And over the years that followed, hurricanes did not increase. It turned out that the blip up was a temporary one, etc. And instead of saying, get lost, you horrible skeptics, she said, maybe you have a point. And then ClimateGate happened, which was when all those emails leaked about how climate scientists, particularly in the UK, were biasing the data and what they said in the public in order to stay on message. And Judith Curry reacted to that by saying, wow, that is not the way we're supposed to behave in science. And she tried to position herself as an honest broker in the middle to try and get the skeptics and the alarmists to talk to each other, and she found that very difficult. And then she started getting accused of being a denier. And a professor called Michael Mann, who's a climate scientist, wrote to people in her department and said, don't promote this woman, she's a denier. And that killed her career. And she had to leave academia and set up on her own as an independent. That's the kind of thing that's been happening to intimidate anyone. Now, Judith Curry is too tough to be intimidated. But, you know, contrast Judith Curry with a woman who's 50 years younger than her, Greta Thunberg, who is a climate rock star despite knowing absolutely nothing about the topic. We've got a real problem here. We genuinely censored and blacklisted anyone who expressed even remote skepticism about climate. You know, I'm not a denier. They call me that all the time. I don't deny that carbon dioxide has a warming effect. I don't deny we're in a warming period. I don't deny that human emissions are contributing. I just deny that it's a massive existential threat that is more important than affordable energy for the poor in the developing world.
Who do you think benefited the most from this narrative?
Well, I think the scientific community did benefit greatly from this. It became, it got all over the news, it got a lot of money. You know, there was no doubt that if you added the word climate change to your paper on, I don't know, how often people sneeze or whether or not cats are getting fatter. You know, if you said climate change is causing cats to get fatter, I made that up, by the way, but if you said that, and there were extraordinary papers saying this sort of thing. I mean, there was a paper saying that fish were behaving differently because of ocean acidification. Turned out it was fraudulent. The data was actually fabricated, and that paper had to be retracted. But there were thousands and thousands of papers like this. So in academia, it became not just essential that you paid obeisance to the climate change scare, but actually very lucrative if you did so. Meanwhile, in industry, it was fine because remember you say, right, well, we're going to do more about climate. Please can we have grants? Please can we charge more to our customers? So they weren't bothered. And as for politics, have you noticed something? Whenever there's a disaster like fires in California or floods in Texas or something like that, or floods in Spain a couple of years ago, the politicians say, it's climate change. Now, why do they say that? Because it absolves them of responsibility for what they should have done to prevent that. In the case of California, prescribed burns are what you need in that vegetation, always and always have been. But if you say, oh, it's climate change, it means there's nothing I could have done about it, it's not my fault. So for politicians, climate change was the perfect excuse.
On the flip side of this, do you think the fossil fuel companies have been unfairly labelled as the bad guys?
I think there's a very odd attempt to sort of make it out that there's some kind of drug dealers who are forcing their products on us in a sort of evil way. I'm sorry, we go and buy their products willingly, day in, day out. The light in this room, the soles of my shoes, the fuel that got me here in a car. So, when we say the fossil fuel industry is causing this problem, we should be saying we are causing this problem because we buy their products. All they do is supply us with our needs. Now, without fossil fuels, and fossil fuels still give us about 80% of our energy, and that number has hardly changed in 20 years. If you look up the particular numbers and depending on the assumptions you make about the efficiency of converting fossil fuels into usable energy and things like that, it's gone from 77% to 76% in 25 years, right? So we still can't do without them. They're supplying us with plastics, they're supplying us with materials, they're supplying us with light, they're supplying us with the fleeces we wear in winter, etc., etc. We cannot run an industrial developed economy without oil, coal and gas, without the hydrocarbons. There is no way to do it. Nuclear can't fill the gap anything like quickly enough, and anyway it would be extremely expensive. And as for solar and wind, the unreliables as I call them, because they, it may come as a surprise to some people, but the sun doesn't shine at night and the wind doesn't blow every day.
Soon enough, another crisis will come along that will kind of be hijacked in the same way. I mean, how do we kind of make sure that doesn't happen?
One of the things I've done over the years is notice that there's always an existential threat. And when I was young, it was the population crisis. But then there was a whole series of other ones in the 70s and 80s. The pollution was getting worse, and the ice age was coming back, and the forests were disappearing, and the deserts were advancing. Whatever it was, there was always an environmental or other crisis, grey goo from nanotechnology, the Y2K computer bug, when the computers couldn't cope with the end of the millennium. Because it's lucrative, because saying the sky is falling is actually a profitable thing to do. Today, you are seeing a lot of the people who were talking about climate change until recently begin to talk about other things. One of the ones they're trying out is artificial intelligence. Okay, this is the AI agents are going to destroy the world and not let us switch them off, or something like that, or it's going to cause mass unemployment. I think that scare is also overblown. I think AI is going to produce problems, but it's also going to produce wonderful solutions for people. I think it's going to be an egalitarian technology. It's going to help people of low ability more than it's going to help people of high ability, for example. So I personally am pretty optimistic about what AI can do for mankind. But there's no doubt, whenever innovation happens, somebody comes along and says this is scary. And they say we must be precautionary, etc. They did it for genetically modified crops, resulting in Europe completely missing out on a very environmentally and economically beneficial technology that would have reduced our reliance on chemicals and so on. And 500 years ago, they did it for coffee. Coffee was novel in Europe in the 1500s. And what did rulers do all over the continent? They banned it. Why did they do that? Because there were scares about the health effects of coffee put out by the wine and beer industry. They were at it then, 500 years ago. And because when you drink coffee, you get a little bit animated, and you usually do it in a coffee shop, and you have a conversation. And in that conversation, sometimes you say, the king is not doing a good job. Now, the king didn't like that. And so if you read Charles II's proclamation in 1672 against coffee shops, he specifically says we must ban these things because they're spreading fake news. So we will never escape these pessimistic scares, and we will always be over precautionary about. Now, that doesn't mean we don't need to worry about bad things happening, of course, but we also need to worry about preventing good things happening. And that's what we don't do enough of, in my view.
In Britain, still firmly committed to net zero. Based on what we've discussed, do you think that's still a valid journey to go on?
I think Britain's commitment to net zero is economic suicide of the most drastic kind. I think it's a huge mistake. I said so when it was brought in 2019, I think it was, and in Parliament I said so, and I said, where's the cost estimate? And they refused to produce it on that occasion. We now know that the cost of meeting net zero is likely to be in the order of £7 trillion. That's an estimate that we've just seen just in the last couple of weeks, coming out of the government itself, coming out of NESO, the National Electricity Supply Operator. So it stands for something like the energy supply. Anyway, and that's sort of 3 times our total GDP. So we'd have to work flat out and give ourselves nothing except net zero technologies for 3 years. No food, no water, no holidays, no clothing, it doesn't work. Not possible. No light. And the reason for this is because the political system has been way too optimistic about renewable energy in particularly, and way too pessimistic about what happens if we don't get to net zero. So they've been ridiculously alarmist about what a degree or 2 of climate change would do, and ridiculously starry-eyed about how they can bring down the cost of meeting this problem. We're we're officially, through the Climate Change Committee, this awful body of sort of bossy commissars who want to tell us how to behave, we are officially going to be required to reduce the amount of meat we eat, reduce the number of holidays we go on, lower the thermostat settings in our homes, and pay much more for our electricity, convert all our heating in our homes to electric, which is so-called air source heat pumps, etc., all of which is extraordinarily expensive. We are being asked to go for extreme austerity to prevent what? To prevent our children and grandchildren being slightly poorer? Because that is what is projected, by the way. If you look at the IPCC's own 5 scenarios for what might happen to GDP in the future, none of them have our grandchildren poorer before or after climate change. They say that instead of being 5 times as rich in 2100, our children will be 4.5 times as rich. Now, I'm sorry, in what world do you say to poor people today in Africa who haven't even got electricity, you must make sacrifices so that people who are 5 times as rich don't have to be only 4.5 times as rich? That is the most regressive policy I have ever heard of. But that is roughly what we are asking to do by pursuing net zero. I'm sorry I get so animated about this, but I genuinely think it's an issue of compassion. We are asking the poor to make sacrifices for the rich.
Do you think the establishment would be able to backtrack on net zero and hold their hands up and actually cancel it?
I think if you look at what's happened in America, the air can go out of the balloon quite quickly. In America, Chris Wright, the Energy Secretary, has cut off a lot of the funding that was going to support pressure groups that were agitating on behalf of climate change. And as a result, the conversation has just fizzled out. And people are now, if you talk to the tech bros in California, they're all fanatically fascinated by how they're going to get energy for their data centers and their AI engines. And they're going mainly to natural gas for that, but they're also talking about nuclear and maybe solar in some way. But decarbonization is hardly on the agenda. They don't mention it anymore. So I think the same could happen in this country. I think Britain could quite quickly climb off the bandwagon for most people. Now, of course, there'd be some people left with egg on their faces if that happened, or some people who would be so angry that they would lash out in some way. And there is going to be a problem of that, of how do we, as it were, talk these people down off the tree they've climbed. But I don't see that it's politically impossible. I think it can be done. And I think it's necessary. We've got to get realistic. We have the most expensive electricity in the world of any major country. There may be a small country with more expensive electricity, but of any major country for industrial users, we are the most expensive in the world. For domestic users, we are second only to Germany. That is not a league you want to be top of. Electricity is crucial to the very process of economic activity and growth. Not just old industries like steel, but new industries like data and AI.
Do you see the underlying problem of all of this, that we put ideology above kind of science and even above facts?
There has always been an ideological element to conversations about science and about environment and so on. And it got kind of carried away with the global warming craze. And one of the reasons that happened was because it was always in the future. So there was never any point at which you could say, hang on, this isn't happening. Because they could always say, yes, it hasn't happened yet, but wait till next year, wait till next decade, etc. With something like acid rain, they had a tremendous burst of excitement for a couple of years, but then it gradually became clear that no, these trees weren't dying, or we've stopped sulfur emissions from power stations anyway, so the problem's gone away. So they had to move on to something else. The climate change thing got very ideological and kept going for a long time. And the media has a lot of blame for this because bad news sells and good news doesn't. Good news is no news. As they, that's the opposite of saying no news is good news, but good news is no news as well. As far as if it bleeds, it leads, as they say in the newspaper industry, and that's got worse over the years as the media landscape has become more and more competitive. And so anyone who stands up and says, there's a professor in Cambridge who says, look, the only way we're going to meet net zero is if we ban flying altogether. And even the other alarmist academics have turned on him and said, look, steady on, old chap, that really is going too far. But he got himself an article in the Financial Times saying that, so what's not to like as far as his career is concerned?
Maybe they'll say flying for us but not for everyone else.
Yes, there would always be an exemption for the elite.
So is this a kind of a wider thing in science, this pushing of ideology above facts?
I think we are in a worrying place where there has been an increasing tendency to be ideological in science, and there's some actual quantitative analysis of this showing that in terms of grant applications, words like equity and justice have dramatically increased, and words like truth and fact have decreased. And what's happening here is that there is a sort of ideological drive going on through science, as there is through the humanities and as there is through business. And there's always been, this has always been true to some extent, that people have had motivated reasoning and confirmation bias, where they believe their own theories and want them to be true and don't look for contrary evidence and things like that. It's only human that happens. But what kept science honest before was the fact that it had multiple centres and multiple funding sources, so that Professor A in University A woke up in the morning saying, I'm going to prove Professor B wrong. I think he's an idiot, and I'm going to show that. Okay, that was healthy. That was necessary. And that's how we got this fantastic scientific cornucopia that we did over the past century. Now, because there's sort of one funding stream basically through the government, and yes, you can say things like the Wellcome Trust are also funding science, but they're basically very close to the government. They don't ever step out of line. And there was this push to declare consensus again and again in science. It became, I'm sorry to say, like the Catholic Church. There's one true faith, and you have to do what the Pope says, which I don't think is the way that science should operate. Let me give you a very specific example. Research into Alzheimer's disease is, everyone will agree, very important. The progress has been very slow, very disappointing. If you go back and examine what happened there, one hypothesis that these amyloid plaques that form in the brain are the problem and the thing that must get tackled, and if you can dissolve these plaques, you will cure Alzheimer's. That one hypothesis became dominant in the area. And when they developed a transgenic mouse that developed the amyloid plaques, they got very excited and said, this is brilliant. And the company that did that sold for $1 billion, and they developed drugs that affected the amyloid plaques, and they had no effect on Alzheimer's. And somebody said, well, hang on a minute. These mice don't actually show any cognitive problems. And actually the people, in some cases, people with more amyloid plaques who are genetically prone to Alzheimer's are doing better than people with fewer amyloid plaques. Maybe this is a symptom of the disease trying to clear itself, not a cause of the disease. But anybody pursuing a different theory was basically excluded from the funding and from the conversation. That is beginning to change now, and the amyloid plaque hypothesis is on life support, frankly. within Alzheimer's. But it's a smaller example of the kind of thing that happens where you try and prematurely declare a consensus in science. Science isn't really about consensus. There was a wonderful quote from Richard Feynman that science is about proving experts wrong, actually. That's what it does. The facts come along and destroy the theories. So I think there's many examples of this where we need to reform science and make it capable of enduring a lot more challenge, and that will make it much more productive and much more successful. It won't be comfortable for the people who are within each of these consensuses, but it's necessary.
What do you think we can do to achieve that?
Well, I think one of the things to do is to break up the funding into rival streams. Right. I think we need, it's sometimes called, what do you call it, red teaming. You fund a red team to attack a blue team, and that makes the blue team honest, as it were. I think that's probably a military expression, but it's the same idea. We should be deliberately seeking out mavericks and heretics, not the complete nutters, not the flat earthers, but there's plenty of people who say, I don't accept that consensus, and I think it's a different theory, and we should say, you should have some money too, and you should have a go at proving your theory, and if you're wrong, so be it, but at least we challenged it.
Looking at innovation, where do you think Britain is at in terms of kind of innovation and progress along those lines at the moment?
I think Britain has enormous opportunity to be a very innovative nation. We have this extraordinary track record. I mean, if you take biology and bioscience alone, the subject I know best, we are second to none. I mean, we're better than the Americans, better than the Germans in terms of our track record. Evolution, DNA, etc., etc. Just this, cloning, DNA sequencing, everything started here. It's an extraordinary track record. So in terms of science, in terms of discovery, in terms of the tradition of innovation going back to, Stephenson 200 years ago last year in the railway, or going back even further than that to Watt and Newcomen and things like that, we are a remarkable nation in terms of what we proved we can do as innovators. But I think the conditions for innovation are not good in this country at the moment, because what innovators need is, above all, is freedom. The freedom to invest in their ideas, the freedom to change their minds, the freedom to get together and collaborate, etc. And they need affordable energy to do that. And innovation comes from the bottom up. It doesn't come from the top down. The number of occasions where government said, we want you to invent this and not that, are very few and far between. The internet, the mobile phone, all the sort of stuff that we deal with, we didn't see it coming. We didn't predict it. It wasn't part of a government. Well, government was funding science and discovery, of course it was, but so was industry. And suddenly someone would say, hang on a minute, I've got an idea. I think I can change the world with this idea. So we need to be much more bottom up, and we're obsessed with picking winners in this country, saying we want to champion, whatever it is, graphene or something like that, and then it turns out no, that isn't the really exciting thing. So I think Britain, with the right policies and a much more a much less dirigiste approach, could have a fantastic future, but we're not there yet.
So would you say the main things blocking the freedom to innovate here are the electricity prices, but also over-regulation?
Yes, I mean, the regulatory environment is truly terrible here for innovators. It's not so much the cost of obeying regulations, it's the time cost. The time it takes to get a bureaucrat to give you permission to set up a business, for example, or to be allowed to do an experiment, can be years if not several years. Whereas in China, it's minutes. I mean, that's an exaggeration probably, but it's basically true, is that the bureaucratic delays in the planning system, in the regulatory approvals, in all the consultations that have to happen are massive in this country. And you see that obviously in things like taking 30 years not to build a runway at Heathrow, or having consultations about a tunnel across the Thames where the consultation laid end to end is longer than the tunnel in terms of pages of paper, things like that. But that is affecting innovation too. I mean, I personally think that even our intellectual property regime in this country mitigates against innovation. The theory of intellectual property is that it should encourage innovation. People should be after copyrights and patents too, which would encourage them to innovate. But actually, if you look at it, these rather lengthy patents and copyrights that we grant people are used to block other people coming in with rival innovations. Have been for a long time, actually. And we've lengthened the terms of these, and we've made it easier to get these patents and copyrights, and I don't think we should. I think we need to be much more laissez-faire about innovation. Just let it happen. And if somebody gets off to a good start and invents something, then he's got a lead. He doesn't need it, to be able to go to court and protect it. In most of the software industry, patents turned out to be useless. They didn't earn people anything. So there's plenty of innovation that can happen without that.
Innovators, entrepreneurs around the world, what are their views on Britain at the moment?
I find it very depressing when I go to California or Texas and they look on me with pity. They say, "Oh my God, you poor guys in Britain. What is going on in that country?" And I said, "Do you want to come and invest with us?" "No, God no, it's terrible. You won't. Your energy is expensive, your bureaucratic regulation is terrible, your planning system is sluggish. I'm sorry, we're going somewhere else. Roll on Brazil or Singapore or something." That's very depressing, because that wasn't always the case. 20 years ago, you go to America and people would say, "My God, what's happening in Britain? We need to get in there. We need to be part of that conversation." And that's no longer true.
So, brilliant innovators and inventors, what do they bring to the world that other people don't? Why are they so important?
When you think about Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk or someone like that, or even Thomas Edison going back a century and a half, they deliver enormous benefits to us, the consumer. And if they get a little bit rich along the way, it's a tiny effect compared with the wealth of the benefits that we earn from that. Bill Gates, likewise. The sheer benefit in terms of reducing the time it takes for me to earn my needs and my desires, because of the fact that I've got a dirt cheap device in my pocket that is a phone and a compass and a map and a computer and all these things that it is. The benefits of that accrue mainly to us, the consumers, not to them, the producers. I personally think that it's a mistake to deify inventors as geniuses, because actually when you talk to them, mostly what they stress is the fact that it was trial and error that got them there. Now anyone can do that. Anyone can, get up at 3 a.m. and work really hard doing lots of experiments. Thomas Edison tried 6,000 different types of plant material before he settled on the right one for the element of his light bulb. That's why he was better than Swan in this country and Ledygin in Russia. They had also invented light bulbs, but they weren't as persistent. They didn't do as much perseverance as that. Jeff Bezos used to say that if you're not swinging and missing, you're not going to hit. That's a baseball metaphor, but what it means is you've got to keep trying, and actually half the time you'll fail. And you can tell the story of Amazon as a story of failure after failure. They got a lot wrong in their early years. They went into toys and it was a disaster. They went into various ways, but every now and then they got something right, and that was enough to get them to the next stage, and then they became the biggest company in the world and the backbone of the internet and all that, and then Jeff lost interest and went off and became a celebrity instead, which is a pity. Elon Musk is a very interesting example, because to some extent I was pretty skeptical about a lot of his early stuff. It was hugely dependent on subsidy in the solar industry and in the electric car industry. And I thought, well, why space? You know, what's the big deal here? Well, hang on, he has turned space into a lucrative part of the telecommunications industry. You know, these Starlink satellites are an extraordinary opportunity. He has massively brought down the cost of launching stuff into space. He has now launched more tonnage into space than NASA did in the whole of its history so far, right? That's pretty extraordinary. And as I discovered last year when I was in California, particularly in El Segundo, a part of Los Angeles, which is where SpaceX started, there is now an extraordinary sort of clan of companies that have been started by SpaceX people, separate from SpaceX, doing things like supersonic flight or drones or tunnels or you know, it's not just space now. What Musk has done, I realise, is solve the problem that Peter Thiel was talking about for many years, the great American venture capitalist, which is that we're innovating in electrons, in bits, but not in atoms, in things. You know, we're no longer building new machines. We're just building new software and things like that. Musk has changed that story. People are, as I say, they're building supersonic planes, they're boring tunnels, they're at half the price. You know, there's all sorts of real-world things. I mean, I went to see a company in San Francisco that's doing prosthetic arms that can be controlled by the nerve signals in your shoulders, and that's AI dependent, but it's a real thing. You know, it means that somebody who has a prosthetic arm can now move fingers in a controlled way just by thinking about his phantom arm, and it works. You know, so I think. Now, when I say don't deify these guys, I don't like the line, Musk or Bezos is so creative that he's a Superman. He's got different blood flowing through his veins than the rest of us. He has wings on his back. You know, it just ain't true. They're just like you and me, except they've got that much more open-mindedness, persistence, and ability to think outside the box, and we can teach that to our kids. You know, so when we talk about creativity, I sometimes think we put children off the idea that they too can be innovators. An awful lot of innovation happens when ordinary people say, "I think I want to try and solve this problem," and then if they collaborate and they share their minds and bring collective wisdom to it and do a lot of experiments and stay up late at night and things like that, then they do achieve it.
A lot of people feel Britain's in decline at this time as the sun is setting. I get the feeling you feel differently. Do you feel we can make Britain great again? You have a positive outlook for the future?
I think we're in relative decline of a rather alarming kind. We were beginning to rival America's GDP per capita 20 years ago. We were catching up with them. We're now way behind America, and we're soon going to be overtaken by Poland. That's ridiculous for this country because we've got so much going for us. You know, we're in the Atlantic, we're next to Europe, we've got a fantastic infrastructure, we've got a great tradition, we've got the rule of law, we've got markets. We ought to be punching the lights out as an innovative nation at the moment. I think we might be in for such a shock of incompetent government over the next 3.5 years under the Labour regime that we've got now, that it's almost going to help because we're going to realise that it can't go on like this and we have to get back to doing what we're good at. So in that sense, I have a glimmer of hope that we will turn things round as we have done before in the past. and get back to what we're good at. But it won't be easy.
Ridley, pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you very much.